Hey everyone, this is Caitlin Leopold, your registered dietitian. And today's topic, I definitely wanted to talk about carbohydrates. We all know that they're a very important topic, and I definitely feel like carbohydrates get a bad rep, especially in today's society. So I really did want to just touch base and talk about today why we need them and how we can incorporate them into our diet plan. So before we dive a little bit deeper into carbohydrates, I did want to touch base on macronutrients. So why we're talking about macronutrients today is because there are three main types of macronutrients, also known as macros, which you probably heard before. And these are the nutrients that make up our food and provide the big picture in our body. So our body needs these in abundance, okay? They provide the calories that make up our food, and they just help us with many daily functions, as you can see here on this slide. They help us with our ability to digest our food and absorb our nutrients. They aid with hormone production as well as immune system health. They help with metabolic function as well as provide our cell structure and help that function as well. So the three main macronutrients, I apologize there, are our carbohydrates, which we're going to talk about today. And the next few weeks following, we will be talking about the next one. So protein and fat. So just to emphasize, right, our three macronutrients are our carbs, protein, and fat. So what is a carbohydrate? So they are essentially a major food source and our preferred energy source for our body. Okay, so I do want to emphasize there are preferred energy source for our body. Carbohydrates provide us with 4 calories per gram. If you don't, I mentioned in a few webinars back. So what that just means, right, when I look at a food label, there are example, maybe like 25 grams of carbohydrates in there. If you just multiply that by 4, that'll show you how many calories are actually from the carbohydrates. So the one thing I do want to emphasize about carbohydrates, for me, typically, right, what pops in your head when you think about carbohydrates? For most of us, right, we instantly think starches and grains. And I think even sometimes, right, we get in a mindset that they are bad. And I definitely want us to kind of just step away from that. Me as a dietitian, actually, the first thing that pops in my head when I think of carbohydrates is energy. Without carbohydrates, our energy is typically not where it is. So when we consume a carbohydrate, it is essentially converted into glucose, which is also known as our blood sugar. And this is what our body uses for energy. Then the excess sugar, so the excess glucose, can be stored in the liver and our muscles, and in storage form it is known as glycogen. And then that glycogen is there for when our body needs it. So in our case that we might not get enough carbohydrates, or right, I didn't eat enough carbohydrates before I went to work out, we actually get those stores from our liver and our muscles. And then from there on, our body actually requires, typically this is kind of the bare minimum I usually say, is about 130 grams of glucose. So, I mean, this is how much glucose our brain needs and our central nervous system just for optimal functioning, okay? So when we consistently do not get enough, our body can get carbs out of storage, as I mentioned with the glycogen. And if we completely cut out carbs, our body will eventually go into a state of ketosis. And I'm going to dive a little bit deeper, excuse me, towards the end of this presentation today about ketosis. I have a complete slide dedicated to it, but just know, right, when we need it and we don't get enough from carbohydrates, our body can start to get the energy from fat. So fat is a slower source of fuel than glucose, which typically means that it just takes longer to access it, so it just makes it harder to get going during exercise. Okay, so all in all, carbs are definitely important. Usually, typically what I see as a registered dietitian, and when I meet with a lot of you guys, the biggest complaint I get is energy. And typically when I go through a lot of times our food logs, carbohydrates is one of the biggest things that we're typically short on. and it's one of the main things that we're typically fatigued and pretty tired. It's actually the lack of carbs. So just a reminder, right? Carbs do the body good. We just need to eat the right types, okay? They fuel our central nervous system. They provide energy for our working muscles, and they also prevent protein from being used as energy, okay? So if we don't get enough of our carbohydrates, we can also get it from fat and protein, and long term that can actually cause us to lose muscle mass as well. So we do need carbs. So what foods contain carbs? So as you can see here, fruits being the first one, most all fruits contain carbohydrates. Our vegetables, the main ones that I typically say to focus on would be your corn, peas, and potatoes. These do contain the most carbohydrates. And then we have our milk and milk products. So this includes our, when I say milk and milk products too, I mean our cow's milk, almond milk, and your alternative milks do not contain that many carbohydrates. So milk and milk products, including our yogurt, and then our grains, and then our legumes, which equates to be our beans and lentils as well there. So as you can see, a lot of these foods listed have nutrients that we don't necessarily get from our other foods. So another reason why I advocate that it's super duper important that we get a lot of our carbohydrates from our healthy food sources here. So I'm going to break down the chemistry a little bit here, but there are three main types of carbohydrates. So it breaks down to sugar, starch, and fiber. So sugar is essentially the simplest form of our carbohydrates, and it occurs naturally in some foods, specifically being our fruits and milk products, and then some vegetables. The types of sugar include our fruit sugar, which would be our fructose, and then the other natural sugar would be our milk sugar, which would be our lactose. So as again, these are natural occurring sugars, and typically, actually, these are the forms of sugar that I actually prefer you to have, the fructose and lactose versus our added sugars, and specifically too, as you can see here, our table sugar, which is sucrose. So we want sugar in its natural form. And then starch is a complex carbohydrate, meaning it is made of many sugar units bonded together. And starch occurs naturally in our vegetables, grains, cooked dry beans, and peas. And then we also have our fiber, which is another complex carbohydrate, and again occurs naturally in our fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and cooked dry beans and peas. So do remember, right, fiber is essential to keep everything moving properly in the body, okay? We actually need 25 to 35 grams daily, and the average American actually only gets 14, okay? So the main thing I want to emphasize is, and what we usually have it classified as bad, is because all carbs aren't created equal, right? We want to focus on getting less from our refined and processed carbohydrates and aim more for our whole food sources that are high in fiber essentially too, okay? So we want our whole foods and these complex carbohydrates that I kind of mentioned, which would be our starch and fiber. There are a few terms as well that you've likely seen before that relates to carbs that I just wanted to talk about a little bit on today's presentation. So you've probably seen before low carb or net carbs. The one thing I did want to emphasize is the Food and Drug Administration doesn't actually regulate these terms, so there's actually no standard meaning. If you see the word net carbs, that actually just typically refers to the amount of carbohydrates in a product, excluding the fiber or excluding both fiber and sugar alcohols. So typically what I usually say is it can be kind of confusing to calculate net carbs. I would rather just have you focus on your overall number of carbohydrates versus calculating the net carbs, because as I said, I know it can get a little confusing there. As long as you're aiming for your whole grains and your complex carbohydrates that we mentioned, as well as your beans and your fruits and vegetables, you're typically going to be eating foods that are lower in net carbs. So we just, as I said, aim for complex carbohydrates with a decent amount of fiber versus counting net carbs, because as I said, that can just get confusing overall. And glycemic index, if you've ever heard this term, it's actually a classification of essentially how carbohydrates affect our blood sugar levels. So foods with a relatively high glycemic index is typically your potatoes, white bread, and typically your processed snack foods and processed foods there with refined flours. So basically, right, they just release faster in our bloodstream, thus increasing my blood sugars a little bit faster. That's what high glycemic means. And then our low glycemic, which includes our whole grains, legumes, vegetables, fruits, and even low-fat dairy products, are naturally lower, which means they just take longer to absorb in our bloodstream. So I actually, on this next slide here, I attached a graphic, which I really like to show, that shows what happens when we consume a high glycemic food item essentially by itself. So as you can see here, the bottom being the amount of time, and then the left being our blood sugar levels here. So when I consume a high glycemic food item, as I said, by itself, example it being white bread, right? It immediately released into my bloodstream as blood sugar levels. As you can see, it's pretty quick rise there. It's up there just for a little bit and crashes in a sense, okay? So as you can see, it didn't even stay in my system over an hour. So what would happen here, right? I would consume an item. Usually I kind of use a Pop-Tart as an example, right? Because that's pure sugar typically. So what that's going to do is raise my blood sugar levels, give me energy maybe for 30 minutes to an hour, and as you can see, crash right back down. So what's going to happen when that crashes right back down? Same thing, I'm going to get tired, I'm going to get fatigued, I'm going to get hungry, then I'm going to grab something else pretty quick. And typically for most Americans, right, it's the same thing. It's a processed packaged food item. Same thing. Example, maybe someone had donuts in the break room. Same thing, if I just have a donut, immediately increases my blood sugar, stays up for a little bit, crashes back down. So what happens when it increases like that, right, our body releases a bunch of insulin and tries to get it back down. So when these consistent examples of these drastic rise and drops over time, that's actually what causes, it could cause insulin resistance and even lead to diabetes. So that's why we definitely want to avoid these constant mountains, as you can see here, versus these smaller mounds at the bottom. So as the bottom is our low glycemic food item. So here, just an example, right? They have lentils, beans, hummus, or peanuts. So when we consume a low glycemic food item or pair a high glycemic food item with a lower glycemic food item, such as, even your protein, fiber, or fat, it's released slower in our bloodstream. So as you can see, right, it doesn't go as high. So it's not causing me to release a bunch of insulin, but still a little bit. And it lasts a little bit longer in our bloodstream. And typically, it doesn't even get as low as it did with the high glycemic. So we don't have those drastic peaks and valleys. Okay, so we want to eat in a way where we have these lower hills versus these drastic peaks and valleys. So low glycemic food items typically is what we want to aim for, or always pairing those high glycemic foods with a protein, fiber, or fat, and that can also slow down the absorption in our bloodstream. And again, if you have any questions, I know I usually mention this at the end, but if you have any questions specifically about glycemic index or definitely have more interest in it, let me know, and I can give you the resources and we can just talk a little bit more about it, because I know it can get a little bit confusing and I just touched a quick base on it right now. So carbohydrates, how much should we consume? So as you can see by that first bullet point, it actually just depends essentially on our goals, activity level, and even our weight there. But the dietary guidelines for Americans typically recommends that carbohydrates make up 45 to 65% of our total daily calories. So as you can see by the next example, if you were eating a 2,000 calorie diet, between 900 and 1,300 calories should be from carbohydrates. So divide that by 4, because if you remember, it provides 4 calories per gram. That would break down to about 225 to 325 grams of carbs a day. So as I said, it kind of just depends on the person. Remember, I said the bare minimum I want you to have is 130. General rule that I kind of use for women, typically I say just aim for 30 to 45 grams per meal. And then men, general rule, just aim for 45 to 60 grams per meal. And depending on how many you eat with your meals, I kind of say aim for about 15 to 30 grams per snack with that. And also just depends on how many snacks you have as well. As I said, carbs aren't bad. We as Americans just consume way too many and not the right types. So as I said, if you just aim to eat this amount, so 30 to 45 for women, 45 to 60 for men per meal, you generally will have proper carbohydrate levels as well as your energy. So on this label, we will have a whole presentation dedicated to food labels, so I won't go super in depth with this one. But typically, as you can see by this item here, our total carbohydrates would be 46. And just note too that this is per serving. So as I said, as a woman, we want 30 to 45. So looking at whatever this is, if I already had 1.5 cups, I would already be about at my limit for this meal. So that's one thing. Definitely be aware of carbohydrates to serving sizes on labels, because again, that's usually the biggest problem we run into is we just consume too much. This does break down our dietary fiber, because you remember that's a part and a type of a carbohydrate. So right here, this actually provides 7 grams. So that actually provides 25% of our daily value based on a 2,000 calorie diet, which actually that's a pretty good source of dietary fiber there. And then when it comes to sugar, it has 4 grams of sugar. So 2 being a natural form of sugar and 2 grams being added there. So that's kind of how you would break down the label for carbohydrates. So controlling weight. So I feel like that's one of the biggest myths that you also hear, right? Carbs cause me gain weight, I can't eat them. So evidence shows that eating plenty of fruit, vegetables, and whole grains can actually help you control your weight. So their bulk and fiber content actually aids with weight control by helping you feel full on fewer calories. So typically, as you can see, there's no evidence that shows that it's actually the carbs that are causing people to gain weight. It's actually the calories that are causing this. So as you can see here, carbohydrates are an essential part of a healthy diet, and they provide many important nutrients, okay? So we still need them. As I kind of mentioned in a previous slide, I kind of talked about one of the biggest issues that I see is people not getting enough. So I did want to go, and I don't have a slide for this, I just wanted to touch base on it, but actual signs that we might not be getting enough carbohydrates. And the first one I typically say is exhaustion. So as I mentioned, carbs are our major source of energy, okay? Carbs we eat, right, get immediately burned up for energy or stored as glycogen. And this glycogen is used for later exercise, right? So if we don't replenish these stores and we exercise, right, essentially that's kind of hitting a wall. So that's when we run out of energy. So that's what we kind of want to avoid. But typically that's kind of why that happens, is because we didn't eat enough carbohydrates to fuel us through a hard time of exercising. So when we get to a point, if you're having a hard time concentrating or even staying on your task for work, that could be a sign you're actually not getting enough carbohydrates. Excuse me. And another sign actually typically too is if you're consistently always craving essentially those fast or sugary carbs, same concept there. It actually could be a sign that we're not getting enough of the healthy complex carbs that we do need. And then also a sign that we're not getting enough would be poor digestion, because as I mentioned, right, we need 25 to 35 grams of fiber. So it's a good chance if we're not getting enough carbs, we're typically not getting enough fiber, right? Because we get them from fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and our beans. So the keto diet, as I said, I promised I would talk about. So one question, right, that I typically get is this wonderful keto diet. I typically do not advocate completely getting rid of a food group, especially for long-term success, right? Because it's very hard to say that you're never going to have a decent amount of carbohydrates again, if that makes sense, right? Especially with like holidays and family gatherings, right? It's kind of always hard to say, yes, I'm going to be keto forever. So I definitely just wanted to talk today about what it is and some of the numerous risks that are involved. So a keto diet restricts our carbs, as I said, our primary source of energy, and it forces our body into burning fat for fuel. So this whole process, using fat for fuel, is known as ketosis. So this extent to which carbs are restricted typically actually varies per diet, but on a classic keto diet, we're looking at 5 to 10% of calories from carbs per day. So if I were on an 1800 calorie diet, that's actually only about 20 to 45 grams per day. So I'll just show you an example of what that actually is. So 45 grams is actually maybe about 3 apples. That's just an example. So not a lot of carbs there. So it actually does take about 3 to 5 days of carbohydrate restriction for the body to burn through its glycogen reserves, which is, remember, the stored carbohydrate, and enter ketosis. So there are a few people that I don't usually recommend, especially with the keto diet. And I'm going to talk about deficiencies, but anyone with liver problems or kidney problems, and especially insulin-dependent diabetics. So there is something called diabetic ketoacidosis, if you've ever heard of it. It actually occurs when ketone bodies accumulate to dangerously high levels and alter blood pH. So it primarily occurs, I'm not saying it always does, but it typically only happens with those that are insulin-dependent diabetic. So, right, insulin helps us regulate ketone levels in the blood. So typically, especially if you are diabetic and thinking about it, typically I kind of say I don't recommend it, or definitely have it monitored if you are insulin dependent. So, right, in order to stay in that ketosis, we need to constantly restrict that carbs, even if we have too much one day. Even one meal can actually switch your body back into using carbs as fuel. So again, it's kind of always hard to maintain that. And then one of the things that I typically usually say with keto as well, it typically isn't always monitored by a professional, and with that is it can be high in saturated fat. So, right, typically American Heart Association for proper cholesterol levels recommends that we get no more than 7% of our daily calories from saturated fat. So saturated fat's in all of our animal products. It's higher in our fried foods. It's higher in our red meats, even our bacon, cheese, our dairy. It can be high in that as well. So, right, most people in a keto diet are eating a lot of those things, and over time, right, that can add up pretty quick on our cholesterol levels. So that's one of the reasons too why we don't necessarily advocate it. And as I said, it's typically used for weight loss. So, I mean, does it show that it does show some? Yes, at least short term. But, right, as with any diet, we reduce our calorie intake below our body's needs, right? We're going to lose weight no matter what, whether we're doing keto or just watching what we eat. On a typically designed for weight loss, right, you're actually pairing that calorie reduction with that ketosis. So as we burn again through those glycogen stores, and we enter into ketosis, there is a natural diuretic effect. So that's kind of what you usually see, especially if you see quick weight loss right away. That's actually your body just releasing the water you start losing weight fairly quickly. So that will slow down definitely as your body kind of stables out. And typically, right, if you add carbohydrates back in, unfortunately, you will gain some of that water weight back. So that's why I don't, as I said, typically always advocate the ketogenic diet for that reason, because you're lacking a lot of nutrients, which is going to dive me into this numerous risks. So the first one being our nutrient deficiency. Excuse me, my throat's a little bit scratchy. So nutrient deficiency, as you can kind of mention what I said, our carbohydrate foods are. Whenever we eliminate a food group, right, and limit variety in the diet, you definitely increase your risk for nutrient deficiency, and that would be our vegetables, fruits, and grains. They all have very important micronutrients that our body need, specifically selenium, magnesium, phosphorus, vitamins B and C, and this is just to name a few. This isn't even all of them, okay? So if we're completely eliminating certain food groups, you're also eliminating a lot of nutrients, and believe it or not, our body does absorb nutrients a lot better in their whole food form versus a supplement. So again, if it's not being monitored properly, you're definitely increasing your risk for a nutrient deficiency. And the next, liver and kidney, I kind of put together. So this can increase or make any existing conditions worse. So as I said, it's not necessarily going to cause liver problems, but if you already do have issues, it can definitely make it worse. With so much that fat to metabolize, as I said, it can aggravate your already existing liver condition. Same thing with kidney problems. The kidney helps metabolize and protein, and over time, it may overload them. Again, especially if you do have any other kidney issues before this. Constipation, I know you've already heard me say fiber, fiber, and more fiber. So as you can see, a lot of your carbohydrates are your fiber-containing foods, right? So we need 25 to 35 grams, and it's naturally low in grains and legumes, right? Which is where we get a bulk of our fiber. So while it's not impossible to get enough fiber on the keto diet, you just have to be really intentional about getting enough. And then, fuzzy thinking and mood swings, this is typically more when you start. But, right, glucose, as I said, is our preferred energy source. And over time, and sometimes, right, it may cause that confusion and irritability. So the biggest thing, as I kind of usually say with it, it may cause nutrient deficiency over time. And the biggest thing with it, right, is sustainability. Is this something that you can stick to long term, right? Because most of the time, if it's a quick fix, we're going to eat right back where we did before and possibly gain a lot of that weight back. So that's why I kind of say it's just important to eat our complex carbohydrates. And all carbohydrates have a place in our diet when we're just definitely being conscious and aware of the amounts. So what should I do from here? So summarizing all this up, I hope you gathered, right, that I think carbohydrates are definitely important, and we do need them. As I said, they're our source of energy. So this would be, right, we want to emphasize our fiber-rich fruits and vegetables, right? Aim for whole, fresh, frozen. Even canned is fine. Canned actually does contain a little bit less fiber, but they do have some in them. So canned fruits and vegetables, ideally without the added sugars. Okay, so whole fruits and vegetables add that fiber, water, and bulk, which help us feel fuller on fewer calories and also keep everything moving. So they're super duper important. Choose whole grains, right, which they are low glycemic, and they are better sources than our refined grains of our fiber and other important nutrients such as our B vitamins, specifically too, our folate and niacin there. And our refined grains typically go through a process that strips out a part of the grain along with some of those nutrients. So aim for whole grains if possible. So right, if I look at an ingredient and it claims to be whole grain, that should actually be the first ingredient, especially with our bread. Stick to low-fat dairy products. So milk, cheese, yogurt, and other dairy products are good sources of calcium and protein, as well as many other vitamins and minerals. And just the low-fat versions may help limit calories and saturated fat if that's something you're looking at. And then eat more legumes. So this is more about going plant-based a little bit. Legumes are super important, which would be our beans, peas, and lentils. They have a lot of nutrients, and they even got a little bit of protein in them. They're low in fat, high in folate, potassium, iron, and magnesium, and they contain beneficial fats and fiber. And then added sugars. Remember, natural sugars are a better option, and added sugars aren't harmful in small amounts, but we still kind of want to just watch the amounts there. So dietary guidelines for Americans recommend that less than 10% of our calories you should consume should be from added sugar. And again, we'll touch base on that when we talk about food labels, but that's definitely something to look at moving forward. So all in all, right, carbohydrates have a place in a healthy diet. We just need to choose them wisely, right? Limit foods with added sugars and refined grains, such as you can see, right, our sugary drinks and processed packaged candy and desserts, and go for our fruits, vegetables, and whole grains, okay? So we do need them, and typically if you aim for about 30 to 45 grams per meal for women and 45 to 60 grams for men, you should maintain a healthy weight there, okay? And again, I know that was kind of a quick overview of our carbohydrates. And if you have any more questions, because as I said, I know it's a big topic, feel free to reach out to me. As I said, I am your resource. So if you're like, hey, Caitlin, I want to know more about carbs, I can definitely sit down with you guys and touch base on that. Okay, so you guys all have my email. Again, if you have any questions, and just let me know. And as always, I appreciate you guys hopping on and listening. Thank you.